I've been reef keeping for about 2 years now, and in that time I made mistakes that killed fish, wiped out corals and honestly cost me well over €1,000. And the frustrating part, most of those mistakes were completely avoidable. Nobody really tells you how unforgiving reef tanks can be when you first start. Because from the outside it looks simple. You fill the tank with water, you add some rock, maybe a fish, some corals, and suddenly you have this beautiful little ocean in your living room. But that's not how it really works. Your tank might look ready, but biologically it often isn't. And beginners usually discover that the hard way. I definitely did. So in this video I'm going to walk you through the 7 biggest mistakes I made during my first year of reef keeping. So hopefully you don't make the same ones. Now, before we start, I just want to say something quickly. I'm not an expert, I'm just a hobbyist who, despite spending countless hours researching books, forums and YouTube videos, still managed to make pretty much every beginner mistake possible. I currently run a Sea Reefer 425 and the tank has been running for about 2 years now. And honestly, most of what I know today came from getting things wrong first. So this video isn't advice from someone who did everything perfectly, it's advice from someone who learned through failure. And if you're new to reef keeping, that's probably a lot more useful, so let's start with mistake number 1. Adding expensive or sensitive livestock before the tank is actually mature. And this one taught me a lesson very quickly. One of the first fish I added was a sand shifting goby. A really fascinating fish to watch. At first everything looked fine. He explored the tank, he seemed active, he was constantly sifting sand, but slowly over the course of about 2 months he got thinner and thinner until eventually he died. And honestly that one really bothered me, because at the time I thought my tank was ready. The water parameters looked okay, ammonia and nitrite were 0, so in my mind the tank was stable. But what I didn't understand yet is that a reef tank is way more than just test results. A new tank might look mature on paper, while biologically it's still extremely immature. The bacteria are still developing, microfauna populations are still tiny, the sandbed is still basically sterile compared to an established tank. And for a fish like a sand-shifting goby that matters a lot, because these fish constantly feed on microorganisms living inside the sand. And my sandbed simply couldn't support that yet. There just wasn't enough life in the system. So if you're new to reef keeping, take it slow. Start with hardy fish, hardy corals, give the tank time to mature before adding sensitive or specialized animals. Your future self and your wallet will thank you. Mistake number 2. Ignoring compatibility between fish and corals. And honestly, this one is a little embarrassing because I already knew it was risky before I did it. I added a copper band butterfly fish to a tank filled with LPS corals and buttons, hammer corals, candy canes and a few zoas. And before buying the fish I read all the typical advice online, usually reef safe, depends on the individual fish, might nip at corals, and somehow I convinced myself it would probably be okay. Well, it wasn't. That fish absolutely destroyed my candy cane corals. And if you've kept reef tanks for a while, you know how painful it is to watch expensive corals slowly disappear. And honestly, I can't even blame the fish. That's what butterfly fish sometimes do. I was the one who underestimated the risk. Now, luckily, I still absolutely love the fish. I enjoy watching it every single day. So for me personally, I accepted the trade-off. But the lesson here is important. When people say a fish is reef safe, that doesn't guarantee anything. You need to research how that fish behaves with the specific corals you keep. Not just reef tanks in general, because compatibility in reef keeping is rarely black and white. A lot of it is risk management. Mistake number 3. Adding too many corals or fish too quickly. And honestly, I think this is probably the most common beginner mistake in reef keeping, because when you start, everything is exciting. You go to a fish store or scroll through coral websites and suddenly you just want everything. Different corals, different fish, different colors, and before you know it you've added 5 different things to the tank in a single week. That's exactly what I did. I added different coral species with completely different requirements. Different lighting preferences, different flow preferences, different nutrient requirements, and eventually something would stop looking happy. And maybe one coral wouldn't open fully anymore. Another one would lose color, maybe a fish would start acting stressed, but the problem was I had absolutely no idea what was causing it anymore. Was it the lighting? Was it too much flow? Too little flow? Nutrients? Coral aggression? Maybe tiny pests irritating the coral? I couldn't tell anymore because I changed too many variables at once. And that's something beginners often underestimate in reef keeping. Every single coral or fish you add changes the balance of the system a little bit. So what actually works is going slow, really slow. Start with easier soft corals like a toadstool. It's usually a great beginner option. Add 1 coral, maybe 2 at most. Then wait. Give the tank a few weeks, watch how the coral reacts. Is it opening fully? Does it keep good color? Is it actually growing? Yeah? Good. That tells you the tank is adapting well. Then you can think about adding the next coral. And if you want to move into LPS or SPS corals, do your research first. Start with easier species, things like Montipora or a small hammer coral or frog spawn. They are usually much more forgiving than some of the harder SPS corals. But once you start keeping those corals, you also need to understand something important. These corals actively consume elements from the water to build their skeletons, especially KH, calcium and magnesium. And depending on your tank size and how many corals you have, water changes alone might eventually not be enough anymore. You may actually need to start dosing alkalinity and calcium to keep things stable. That's why patience matters so much in reef keeping. Because when you go too fast, you usually create problems faster than you understand them. And trust me, that becomes frustrating very quickly. Patience in this hobby is not optional, it's strategy. And mistake number 4 goes perfectly together with that. Adding corals before the tank was chemically stable. And honestly, this was probably one of the most frustrating phases of reef keeping for me personally. Because when I first started, my parameters were constantly swinging. Calcium going up and down, alkalinity fluctuating, nitrate changing every week, phosphates moving around, and at the time I didn't fully understand how stressful that is for corals. Especially LPS and SPS corals. Because these corals don't just need good parameters, they need stability. And that's a huge difference. The annoying thing about corals is that they usually don't die immediately when something is wrong. Instead, they slowly decline. A little less polyp extension, a little less color, maybe they stop growing, then tissue recession starts, and because the decline happens slowly, you start second guessing everything. So what do beginners usually do? They start changing random things. You adjust dosing, then lighting, then flow, then nutrients, then feeding. And before you know it, the tank never actually gets a chance to stabilize because you're constantly interfering with it. I definitely made that mistake. I thought it was helping the tank, but in reality I was stressing it even more. And eventually I realized something really important. Stability matters way more than perfection. You do not need perfect numbers. You need stable numbers. A stable alkalinity of 8 is far better than constantly swinging between 7 and 9 trying to chase the perfect value you saw online. Because fish and corals can adapt to stable conditions. What they struggle with is constant change. And honestly, that lesson alone probably would have saved me a lot of frustration in my first year and my second year. Quick question, which one of these mistakes have you made? Because honestly, I feel like almost everybody in reef keeping goes through at least a few of these at some point. So let me know down below in the comments. I'm actually really curious which mistake hit closest to home for you. And if this video is helping you so far, dropping a like really helps the channel and tells YouTube to show this video to more reef keepers. Mistake number 5, chasing perfect parameters. And this one almost drove me insane. I became obsessed with numbers. I was constantly testing the water and trying to hit the perfect value for every single parameter. Perfect alkalinity, perfect nitrate, perfect phosphate. And every time I adjusted one thing, something else reacted. So then I would adjust that. And then another parameter would shift and suddenly reef keeping stopped being enjoyable and started feeling like a chemistry experiment that never ended. Here's what I eventually learned. A stable tank with slightly elevated nitrates is way healthier than a tank with perfect parameters that swings every few days. Fish and corals can adapt surprisingly well to stable conditions, but they do not adapt well to constant instability. And honestly, I think a lot of beginners accidentally stress their tanks by trying too hard to make everything perfect. So stop chasing perfection, chase consistency instead. That mindset alone made reef keeping way less stressful for me. Mistake number 6, neglecting the tank when life gets busy. And this one is very personal because honestly, life sometimes just happens. There were periods where I barely had time for anything. Work got busy, life got busy, and unfortunately the tank slowly started slipping too. Water changes became inconsistent, maintenance got delayed, parameters slowly drifted away from stability, and over time corals started declining. What makes reef tanks tricky is that neglect usually doesn't show immediate consequences. Sometimes everything still looks okay for weeks, but eventually the problems catch up with you. Algae starts appearing, corals stop opening fully, growth slows down, and once you fall behind on maintenance, catching a backup can become overwhelming very quickly. The important thing I learned is that reef tanks actually don't need endless hours of maintenance when things are stable, but they do need consistency. That's the key. And if you know a busy period is coming, prepare for it in advance. Simplify the system, automate what you can, and maybe reduce how many sensitive corals you keep temporarily, or even ask another reefer for help. Because reef tanks are surprisingly good at exposing when life becomes chaotic. And finally, mistake number 7. Buying cheap equipment that failed at the worst possible moment. And honestly, this is one of those mistakes that almost every reefer makes at some point. Because when you first start this hobby, everything is already expensive. So naturally, you try to save money where you can. I definitely did. I bought 2 different RODI systems and eventually both of them failed because the booster pump stopped working. That's around €150 gone. But honestly, the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was suddenly not having clean water available when I actually needed it. And in reef keeping, small equipment failures can turn into big problems very quickly. A failed heater, a broken return pump, bad lighting, an unreliable skimmer. Those things can generally damage a reef tank if you don't catch them in time. Now, I'm not saying you need the most expensive setup possible. You absolutely don't. But for critical equipment, do proper research before buying. Read long-term reviews, look up common failure points, ask experienced reefers, because cheap equipment often becomes expensive eventually. So, those were the 7 biggest mistakes I made during my first year of reef keeping. And honestly, the biggest lesson I learned from all of this is pretty simple. Reef keeping rewards patience and punishes impatience. Go slower than you think you need to. Add things one at a time. Prioritize stability over perfection, and understand that even experienced reefers still make mistakes sometimes. The difference is just that over time you learn from them. And honestly, that's part of what makes this hobby so rewarding. You're constantly learning, constantly improving, and slowly building your own little ecosystem over time. So if you're going through some of these mistakes right now, trust me, you're definitely not alone. Let me know down below in the comments which mistake hit closest to home for you. And if this video helped you, consider subscribing for more reef tank content. Thanks for watching. Ciao!